Jacob Whitman had always imagined peace would come with silence. After 10 years in a city surrounded by honking horns, constant construction, and people shouting at all hours, he was finally free. The small, tree-lined neighborhood on the edge of town was the perfect escape. He bought a cozy 2-bedroom house with a fenced backyard, a porch that creaked in a friendly way, and enough quiet to hear the birds argue in the mornings. Best of all, Scout, his loyal golden retriever, had space to run. The house next door was older, with ivy crawling up the sides and paint that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in decades. Jacob had noticed it when he first moved in, mostly because of the dog that watched him through the fence. A scruffy, silver-furred shepherd mix with eyes that didn't miss a thing. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark at first. He just stared. Calm but ready. The kind of stare that made Scout back up. Jacob soon learned the dog's name was Max, and that he belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Ellison. She lived alone. He only saw her when she came out to sit on her porch in the afternoons, wrapped in a thick cardigan, with Max by her side. She never said much, just nodded, smiled faintly, and returned to her tea. He didn't think much of it. People aged differently. Some became talkative. Others preferred the quiet. He waved every time he saw her, and she waved back with a soft gaze that never quite met his eyes. She always looked like she was thinking about something miles away. Max, however, never warmed up. Every time Scout got close to the shared fence, Max would growl low, steady, and commanding. It wasn't aggressive, not really. More like a warning. Like he didn't want Scout too close to the house. Jacob kept Scout on the other side, assuming Max was just overprotective. Maybe a little territorial. Scout didn't mind. He was more interested in chasing squirrels anyway. One afternoon, Jacob tried talking to Mrs. Ellison while taking out the trash. He asked if she needed help with anything her lawn, the garbage, maybe running errands. She simply smiled again and shook her head. Max stood between them, ears perked, eyes unmoving. "All right then," Jacob said with a light chuckle. "Offer's always open." That was the last full exchange they had. The days passed quietly. Jacob fell into a routine morning walks with Scout, afternoon runs to the store, evenings on the porch with a good book. Life had finally slowed down. And yet, something about Max always pulled at his attention. There was something about the way the dog moved, the way he watched everything, not in fear. In awareness. One Saturday morning, Scout ran to the fence and barked at Max, tail wagging. But Max didn't bark back. He just sat, watching. Jacob chuckled and called Scout back, but as he turned to go inside, he noticed something odd. Mrs. Ellison hadn't been on her porch in 2 days. He paused for a moment, thinking back. Normally, even if she wasn't outside, he'd see her through the window. But lately, her curtains had stayed drawn. Still, he brushed it off. Maybe she was out of town. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. Everyone deserved privacy. But that evening, as a gray sky rolled in and the first drops of rain tapped against the rooftops, Max began to bark, loud, sharp, persistent. Jacob looked up from his book and frowned. Scout, who usually ignored Max's noise, suddenly stood up and stared at the fence. The bark wasn't angry. It was urgent. Jacob stood slowly, unsure what he was hearing, but already knowing something was wrong. Jacob's eyes darted toward the fence, where Max was standing tall, barking sharply in bursts that didn't sound like his usual territorial growl. Scout, his golden retriever, froze, ears perked, and tail stiff. The barking was loud and urgent, cutting through the quiet afternoon. Like an alarm bell, Jacob's curiosity pushed him off the porch. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the fence separating his yard from Mrs. Ellison's. As he approached, The bark's rhythm didn't slow it, became almost frantic, as if Max was trying to tell him something. The sky had darkened further. Heavy clouds swirling with the threat of rain. Jacob peeked through the slats of the wooden fence and instantly noticed something unusual. Mrs. Ellison's front door was wide open, swinging slightly with the breeze. That was odd. She always kept it shut and locked. Usually, if she left it open, it meant she was sitting on the porch or in the yard nearby. But today, there was no sign of her. Jacob's stomach tightened. He called softly, "Mrs. Ellison? Are you okay?" No answer. Max stopped barking momentarily, then resumed louder than before. His eyes locked on the open doorway, like he was warning Jacob to be careful. Scout started whining quietly at Jacob's feet, nuzzling his leg, as if sensing the unease growing inside his owner. Jacob hesitated. Should he just walk away? Maybe Mrs. Ellison was inside, resting or reading, and the open door was nothing to worry about. But Max's persistent barking and all Scout's nervousness told a different story. He took a deep breath and stepped through the gate, feeling the wet grass underfoot as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Inside the porch, the air smelled faintly of old wood and lavender, Mrs. Ellison's favorite scent Jacob had noticed before. He walked toward the door, which creaked open with a soft groan. The hallway beyond was dim, lit only by the fading daylight slipping through the windows. Jacob called out again, louder this time. "Mrs. Ellison? Are you in here?" Still, no answer. His eyes adjusted to the shadows, scanning the room. Then, he heard a faint knocking sound, soft and irregular, coming from the far end of the hallway near the stairs. Curiosity mingled with growing concern as Jacob took slow steps toward the noise. Max suddenly bolted forward, barking furiously and racing toward the back of the house. Jacob followed quickly, his heart pounding. The knocking stopped, replaced by a sudden silence that felt heavier than the gathering storm outside. Near the staircase, the old wooden banister was chipped, and the carpet looked worn from years of footsteps. Jacob's gaze dropped to the floor, and he saw her Mrs. Ellison lay at the foot of the stairs, her thin frame curled awkwardly, pale and still. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, confusion and pain crossing her face. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, with trembling hands, she raised 2 fingers and tapped them against her wrist repeatedly, then pointed toward the side table near the living room. Jacob's mind raced. He had heard about people using silent gestures to communicate in emergency signals, for when they couldn't speak or call for help. He nodded reassuringly and slowly moved toward the table. There, sitting beside the phone, was a small blinking device, a personal emergency alert system. But it wasn't sounding any alarms. Jacob looked back at Mrs. Ellison. She looked exhausted but determined to get help. He knelt beside her and said gently, "Don't worry, I'm here now. I'm calling for help." Max sat quietly beside her, resting his head on her knee, while Scout circled around them protectively. The rain started pouring harder outside, drumming against the windows as Jacob dialed 911. He stayed on the line, answering questions, keeping Mrs. Ellison awake and calm, while Max continued to watch her with unwavering loyalty. Seconds felt like hours, but Jacob never let go of her hand, and in that moment, it was clear the dog's urgent bark was not just noise. It was a warning, a desperate plea, a message waiting to be understood. Jacob's fingers trembled as he kept his phone pressed to his ear, listening intently to the calm voice on the other end of the emergency line. The dispatcher asked him questions. Was Mrs. Ellison breathing steadily? Was she conscious? Could she move? Each answer he gave felt like a thread holding together the fragile hope that she would be okay. Mrs. Ellison's breathing was shallow, but steady enough. Her eyes, though weary, focused on Jacob's face as if drawing strength from his presence. She tried once more to speak, her lips moving silently, but no sound came. Instead, she reached up and squeezed his hand weakly. A silent thank you for being there. Max settled closer, his fur bristling slightly, as if sensing the urgency in the room. Scout, always calm and gentle, lay at Mrs. Ellison's feet, offering silent comfort. The two dogs, so different yet united by loyalty, had become guardians in this unexpected crisis. Jacob glanced around the dim living room, noticing the faint smell of lavender mixed with the earthy scent of rain from the open door. He realized that the room, usually tidy and quiet, held an eerie stillness. The curtains fluttered lightly in the breeze, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. This house, which had been a sanctuary for Mrs. Ellison, now felt like the setting of a silent emergency. His thoughts flicked back to the blinking device on the side table, a small emergency pager that was supposed to alert someone when she was in trouble. He remembered her silent gestures, 2 taps on the wrist, then pointing to the device. It was a code. She had tried to call for help, but failed. Jacob's stomach twisted. Who was supposed to be checking on her? Why hadn't anyone come? A dispatcher's voice cut through his thoughts. Help is on the way. Stay with her, keep her awake, and try to keep her calm. Jacob nodded, though she couldn't see him. I'm here. Just hold on. He adjusted Mrs. Ellison's blanket and gently rubbed her arm. You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Minutes passed, stretching longer with every second. Outside, the storm's intensity grew, rain pelting the windows like a frantic drummer. The power flickered once, then steadied again. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from the hallway, followed by a series of light knocks. Jacob's heart jumped. He looked at Mrs. Ellison, who blinked and weakly gestured again, 2 taps on her wrist, then a sweeping motion toward the door. Jacob understood. She wanted him to check outside. Cautiously, he stood, steadying himself. As he moved toward the open front door, Max followed closely, still alert, his nose twitching at the scent of the storm. Outside, the world was soaked and gray. The streetlights flickered under the weight of the storm. No cars or neighbors were in sight. Jacob scanned the area, eyes searching for anything unusual. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw movement near the mailbox. A man stepped out of the shadows, drenched and shivering. Jacob's heart skipped. Can I help you? He called out, voice firm despite the tension. The man nodded, holding up a phone. I'm from the neighborhood watch. We got the alert someone called in about an emergency next door. Jacob's relief was immediate. Thank God. Mrs. Ellison fell and can't reach her phone. Together, they moved back inside as Max barked softly, leading the way to Mrs. Ellison's side. Jacob realized in that moment that the old dog's barking had been the first call for help. Max had sensed the danger, responding with a warning that could have easily been ignored. But it wasn't that, it was heard. And it was the reason help was coming. As the ambulance arrived minutes later, Jacob stayed with Mrs. Ellison, holding her hand through the flashing lights and the bustle of strangers. Scout and Max sat side by side outside, watching over their human friends. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment Max started, barking the dog's silent plea that revealed a truth no words could capture. He knew then that sometimes the smallest signals hold the greatest meaning. Jacob stayed close to Mrs. Ellison as paramedics carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. Her face was pale, eyes closed, but her fingers still twitched faintly against his hand. The cool night air outside was heavy with rain, but Max and Scout stood firm, guarding their human with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt about their loyalty. As the ambulance pulled away, Jacob felt a strange mix of relief and lingering worry. Questions swirled in his mind. How long had she been alone? Who was supposed to be checking on her? And how had Max known something was wrong before anyone else did? The next morning, Jacob made his way to the hospital. He found Mrs. Ellison sitting quietly in a chair, wrapped in a soft blanket, looking smaller than he had imagined. Her eyes met his with a grateful warmth that needed no words. After introductions, Mrs. Ellison revealed pieces of her story slowly, speaking through gestures and the occasional nod. She had once been a teacher for deaf children, losing her voice years ago after surgery damaged her vocal cords. Speech wasn't something she took for granted. Instead, she relied on hand signals and a special blinking device that could send silent alerts to a caretaker nearby. But that caretaker had moved away 3 weeks earlier, and the emergency system was no longer connected. Jacob listened carefully, piecing together the invisible threads of her life. The blinking device she had tried to use was more than just technology. It was her lifeline. And when that lifeline failed, Max had become her voice. She told Jacob about Max's training, how he had once been a service dog, trained to recognize signs of distress and alert others through barking or physical signals. Max's bark wasn't random. It was a call for help, learned from years of attentive service. Jacob was struck by the depth of trust between Mrs. Ellison and Max. Their bond went beyond companionship. It was a silent partnership built on understanding and protection. The hospital doctor arrived and explained that Mrs. Ellison had suffered a mild concussion and some bruises from the fall, but she was expected to recover fully with rest. She needed to arrange care at home, however, since living alone without immediate assistance was too risky. Jacob felt a strong urge to help. "I can check in on her every day," he offered, surprised by the earnestness in his own voice. "Scout and I can keep her company, and maybe Max too." Mrs. Ellison's eyes softened, a small smile breaking through her usual quiet demeanor. Over the next few days, Jacob's visits became a new routine. He learned to understand Mrs. Ellison's hand signals better and discovered little habits that made her life more comfortable, like placing her medication within reach or making sure her emergency alert was always charged. At the same time, Max's behavior changed subtly. He grew less wary of Scout and allowed the younger dog to get closer to Mrs. Ellison. The two dogs would lie quietly beside her, a peaceful trio in the small living room. One afternoon, while sitting together, Mrs. Ellison raised her hand, tapping 2 fingers against her wrist again, a silent signal that had saved her life. Jacob nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. It was a reminder, a warning that the quietest signals can carry the most urgent truths. Jacob realized then how easily a single moment of awareness, a simple gesture, or even a dog's bark could mean the difference between danger and safety. As he helped her prepare to go home, he promised to ensure the neighborhood would be more watchful, not just for Mrs. Ellison, but for anyone who might need a helping hand. And all along, Max, the old dog with sharp eyes and a louder bark than anyone expected, remained the silent guardian who had first revealed the truth in seconds. Back at her home, Mrs. Ellison's front porch looked the same as ever. Weathered wood, a few faded flower pots, and the gentle sway of hanging plants. But for Jacob, everything had changed. He now saw the house not just as a quiet refuge, but as a place where danger had almost struck, and only quick-thinking and loyal companions had stopped tragedy. Jacob stood in the living room, helping Mrs. Ellison settle into her favorite chair. Scout circled the room before resting by her feet. Max, ever watchful, stayed close by, occasionally glancing toward the door as if standing guard against unseen threats. Jacob checked the blinking emergency alert device again, making sure it was fully charged and properly connected. He had called the company that installed it and arranged for an updated system to be set up, one that would automatically alert emergency responders in the event of another fall or crisis. But he knew technology was only part of the solution. "You don't have to do this alone," Jacob said softly, watching her nod slowly. She still couldn't speak, but her eyes sparkled with quiet gratitude. Over the next few days, Jacob organized a small neighborhood group to help elderly and vulnerable residents. They called themselves the Watchful Neighbors. Every morning and evening, volunteers would check in by phone or in person. They'd pick up groceries, run errands, or just sit and chat. Jacob invited Mrs. Ellison to join a community potluck, but she politely declined with a smile. Social gatherings weren't her thing anymore. Instead, she preferred quiet afternoons with Scout and Max by her side. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob noticed Max suddenly tense. The old dog stood upright, ears pointed forward, barking sharply. Scout joined in, there, voices echoing through the neighborhood. Jacob's heart raced. He grabbed his jacket and hurried outside. Across the street, he saw a figure stumbling near the old oak tree, a man who looked disoriented and unsteady. Jacob called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't respond clearly, just mumbled something incoherent and kept moving toward the road. Jacob rushed over, gently grabbing the man's arm to steady him. "Slow down," Jacob said firmly. "Do you need help?" The man's eyes were glazed, and Jacob realized he might be suffering from heat exhaustion or worse. He called 911 again and stayed with the man until paramedics arrived. Later, as the man was taken away on a stretcher, Jacob couldn't help but think about the night Mrs. Ellison had fallen. How close had things come to disaster, and how important it was to act quickly when signs of trouble appeared. Max and Scout trotted back to Jacob's side, their energy calm but alert. That night, Jacob sat on his porch reflecting on everything that had happened. The old dog's bark, once easy to ignore, had saved a life. Mrs. Ellison's silent signal had guided him through the unknown, and the neighborhood's newfound sense of community was growing stronger. He realized that life was fragile, and sometimes the smallest actions mattered most. As he looked out over the quiet street, Jacob knew one thing for sure. He would never ignore a dog's bark again, because sometimes it was the only way to hear the truth. In the days following Mrs. Ellison's fall, Jacob made regular trips to the hospital, eager to understand more about his quiet neighbor's world. Each visit revealed pieces of a life filled with challenges, resilience, and silent strength. Mrs. Ellison had never spoken much since Jacob moved in, but now, in the hospital's sterile light, her story unfolded. Through gestures and the patient taps of her fingers, Jacob learned that years ago, a surgery to remove a tumor had damaged her vocal cords, leaving her unable to speak. Despite the silence, she had built a life rich in meaning and connection, using hand signals and a blinking device to communicate. Her past as a teacher for deaf children became clear. She had taught not only language, but patience and empathy lessons she carried into her own life. The blinking device was her lifeline, designed to send silent alerts when she needed help. But the caretaker it was linked to had moved away without notifying her, leaving her vulnerable. Jacob felt a swell of guilt. How had no one checked in sooner? How had this been overlooked? Mrs. Ellison's eyes met his, conveying a mix of sadness and acceptance. She wasn't bitter but hopeful. Hopeful that others would learn from her experience. Max, always close, was more than a pet. Trained years ago as a service dog, he was attuned to changes in her condition. His barking wasn't a random noise. It was a deliberate, learned signal and alarm designed to draw attention when she couldn't. Jacob marveled at their partnership. It was a silent conversation between two beings who understood danger without words. During one visit, Mrs. Ellison demonstrated how Max would alert her by barking when he sensed her distress. The dog's eyes would grow wide, and his bark sharp and insistent. Then, she would tap her wrist, twice a silent code prompt in Jacob, to check the blinking device and take action. It was a language built on trust. patience, and necessity. Jacob realized how fragile this system had become without the caretaker. The blinking device had been useless alone. Max's instinct had been the only true call for help. Back home, Jacob researched emergency alert systems and found several designed specifically for people with speech or hearing impairments. He called local agencies, advocating for Mrs. Ellison and others like her to receive better support and education about these technologies. Meanwhile, he helped coordinate with a local volunteer group to provide daily check-ins. The watchful neighbors became a lifeline for Mrs. Ellison and other elderly residents who might otherwise slip through the cracks. Jacob often sat on Mrs. Ellison's porch, learning more about her silent world. She showed him signs for thank you, help, and danger, gestures he memorized carefully. Their friendship deepened, built on shared understanding and quiet respect. One afternoon, as Jacob arrived with groceries, Max greeted him with a wagging tail but a serious expression. Mrs. Ellison tapped her wrist twice and pointed toward the blinking device. Jacob checked it, noticing a low battery warning. He smiled gently. "Don't worry. I'll take care of it." As he replaced the batteries, Jacob thought about how easily something so small could become a matter of life or death. As he lay in bed, Jacob reflected on the invisible battles some people faced daily. The courage it took to live without a voice, relying on silent signals and a loyal dog's bark. He realized that sometimes the loudest cries for help weren't spoken at all. They were felt in the quiet moments between heartbeats. And thanks to Max's bark and Mrs. Ellison's silent code, a tragedy had been averted. News of Mrs. Ellison's fall and how Jacob and the dogs had saved her quickly through the neighborhood. What had started as a quiet street had blossomed into a community more aware and connected than ever before. The story of Max's bark and Mrs. Ellison's silent signals had touched many hearts, inspiring residents to look out for one another in new ways. Jacob found himself at the center of this unexpected movement. He worked alongside neighbors to create the Watchful Neighbors program, a simple but powerful idea. People would check in regularly with elderly and vulnerable residents, making sure they were safe, healthy, and never alone for too long. It was a pact of care and vigilance that grew with every passing day. The group met weekly at the local community center, planning schedules, sharing contact lists, and organizing training sessions. Volunteers learned how to recognize signs of distress and emergencies, including the silent gestures Mrs. Ellison used. They practiced simple communication techniques and were taught to respect privacy while remaining alert. Jacob watched with pride as the neighborhood shifted from polite acquaintances to a supportive family. Mrs. Ellison, meanwhile, was reluctant to be the center of attention. She preferred quiet afternoons with Scout and Max in the garden, where the two dogs played gently under the watchful eyes of their humans. Yet she welcomed the kindness in small ways, grateful smiles, occasional visits, and the reassurance that she would never be left alone again. One afternoon, as Jacob helped Mrs. Ellison water her plants, Max suddenly stiffened and let out a sharp bark. Scout joined in, their barks overlapping with urgency. Jacob froze, recognizing the tone Max was warning again. He followed the dogs to the fence line, where a young boy was struggling to open a stuck gate. The boy looked frightened and lost. Jacob knelt down and gently asked, "Are you okay?" The boy nodded, but said he had wandered away from his parents during a walk. Jacob smiled softly, helping the boy open the gate and guiding him back to the sidewalk, where a worried couple was searching nearby. It was a small incident, but Jacob knew it was exactly the kind of situation Max and Scout were trained to respond to. Their barking was a call, not just to danger, but to help. The neighborhood took notice of these moments, realizing how much the dogs had become part of their community safety net. Jacob also helped organize workshops for residents about emergency preparedness, and the importance of noticing quiet signs, like a neighbor's open door, an unusual silence, or a dog's persistent barking. In time, Mrs. Ellison's home became a symbol of the community's commitment, a place where technology, compassion, and watchful eyes came together to protect the vulnerable. Jacob felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that what had started as a frightening accident had sparked change. He thought often about the moment Max first barked that stormy evening and Mrs. Ellison's silent gesture that led him to the truth. He knew now that a community's strength lay not just in its houses, but in the connections between its people and their willingness to listen even to the quietest voices. As the sun set over the neighborhood, Jacob stood on his porch, Scout beside him, watching Max resting peacefully at Mrs. Ellison's feet. In that moment, he understood that sometimes it was the dogs who spoke the loudest. Truths. The summer days stretched long and warm, and the neighborhood seemed brighter than ever. Jacob sat on his porch one late afternoon, the golden light casting soft shadows over the quiet street. Scout lay stretched at his feet, content and calm. Across the yard, Max snoozed on a patch of sun near Mrs. Ellison's porch, his ears twitching. At every distant sound, Mrs. Ellison herself was sitting comfortably in her favorite rocking chair, wrapped in a light shawl. Her eyes sparkled with a quiet happiness, and though she didn't speak, her smile was enough to fill the space between words. Jacob often thought back to the night when Max's bark had shattered the calm, the night that revealed the truth hidden beneath silence and routine. He had almost dismissed the noise as just a dog being noisy. But that bark was far from random. It was a signal, a call for help that changed everything. That night had taught him to listen differently, to understand that sometimes the loudest voices are those that don't use words. Over the weeks, Jacob had grown closer to Mrs. Ellison, learning her silent language of taps and gestures. He had become her helper, her friend, and in many ways, her lifeline. Scout and Max had become inseparable companions. Their bond deepened by the moment they had saved a life together. The neighborhood's newfound spirit of care had blossomed into a network of support, making everyone feel safer and more connected. Elderly neighbors felt less isolated. Families watched out for one another, and even the dogs seemed to sense the change. One evening, as Jacob walked Scout past Mrs. Ellison's house, Max suddenly barked sharply. Jacob stopped. Alert! Mrs. Ellison lifted her hand and tapped twice on her wrist. The silent code Jacob now recognized instantly. Jacob looked around. Nothing seemed amiss, but he trusted the message. He scanned the street and noticed a young girl, standing near a parked car, looking confused and upset. Jacob approached slowly. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. The girl looked up, tears in her eyes. "I can't find my mom," she said softly. Jacob crouched down. "Let's find her together." Max and Scout stayed close, their presence reassuring. Within minutes, a frantic woman came running down the sidewalk, calling the girl's name. She hugged her daughter tightly, thanking Jacob and the dogs for their help. Jacob smiled, feeling the same quiet pride he had felt months before when Max's bark had saved Mrs. Ellison. It was a reminder that sometimes help came in unexpected forms. A dog's bark, a silent gesture, a neighbor's willingness to listen, all woven together into a story of care and connection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob looked at Max and Scout, grateful for the dogs who had taught him the true meaning of attention and action. Because, in the end, it wasn't just about hearing a bark or seeing a signal. It was about understanding the message behind it. And thanks to that understanding, a life was saved.